Now let's move to our third panelist, Joanne Sheehan. We all know that she's a wonderful organizer, wonderful trainer, non-violence trainer. She was again began to get actively involved with the WRL and WRI. WRL is one resistance league in the US, the section of the WRI in the US, involved in 70s and 80s, and continues to do so, even more so, I believe, in the WRL in recent days when. Uh, and she was also the chair of the WRI from 1998 to 2006, uh, and uh, and even more importantly, she played a key role in proposing the women's working group within the WRI, and Joanne and her colleagues, her co-activists, must have felt or experienced the pertinent need of having a kind of women's working group within this resistance movement. So I hope she will be focusing more her presentation into that as well. Why women's working group was needed, and how does that continues to influence the resistance movement, including not only in within the WRI networks, but also beyond, probably. So, Joanne, please, I invite you for your.
Thank you, Subhash. Yeah, so while I was asked to talk specifically about the Women's Working Group, which began in 1985, I feel like I need to go back and give more of a context to this, because the Women's Working Group grew out of a lot of other activity that went on for the 10 years prior to that. And while I was involved, beginning in WRI in 1975, this isn't my story, it's our story, it's her story. And I am really happy to see and go through the list of who's on and see how many women from the Women's Working Group over this period of time are on. And some of you are going to be quoted in here. I'm afraid I don't want to miss anyone. But to recognize that there were literally hundreds and I think thousands who were involved and affected by this in some way. I also want to recognize Cynthia Coburn, who a number of us had an opportunity to meet, a feminist, peace activist, peace researcher who explored the themes of masculinity and war, and she wrote about War Resisters International in this process. She came to one of our council meetings in the Basque Country, interviewed a lot of men and women in WRI about these issues. So as an organization, War Resisters International's declaration states that war is a crime against humanity. We therefore are determined not to support war of any kind and to strive for the removal of all causes of war. And certainly for the first half of its life, WRI had been seen primarily as an organization who directly worked with those who refused to participate in war, who would have been the men who were conscripted, that was so much the focus. When I first became involved in WRI, I felt like the big issue was actually within that framework, which was it better to be a conscientious objector or a resistor? And that at times took over so much that the women of the Women's Working Group did a skit about this at one of the council meetings. In Cynthia's article, Political and Gender Dynamics of Peace Movements, she wrote about WRI. Throughout its first half century, the War Resisters International was an organization that provided a platform for self-confident and sometimes self-important male leaders of strong opinions and unhesitatingly rhetorical. Notwithstanding, there were some significant women actors in WRI. Grace Beaton was general secretary for no fewer than 23 years, from 1933 to 1956. And she mentions in her article several women who were involved in specific actions in the 60s, particularly Vicky Rovere and April Carter. I also want to do a shout out to Helga, who I'm pretty sure is on this call, who was on staff, and who talked to many of us and told us stories of her role of making copies, making coffee, and being excluded from the meetings that were primarily meetings of the men. That was the situation for much of the first 50 years. And so while WRI adopted the Statement on Toward Liberation in 1972 at the triennial, which was the first reference to women's liberation, that it was really not until the 1975 triennial that there was kind of a breakthrough for the recognizing the role of women in War Resisters International by having a women's theme group. I was at that triennial. That was my first experience with War Resisters International. And I do have to say, I was a bit taken back because as a young feminist in War Resisters League in the chapter in the US, we were already doing a lot of events on feminism and nonviolence. We were making connections between sexism and militarism. And it wasn't always easy. It definitely wasn't. We had our own women's groups. We had our own struggles within the organization, particularly to change the process to be more decentralized, more consensus-based. I was really taken aback by the animosity towards the women's role at WRI at that conference. My sister Kate, who was a War Resisters League intern to WRI at the time, she and I were in the women's working group, the theme group that took place at that triennial. And we were asked to make the presentation to the business meeting and were pretty overwhelmed in some level by the animosity. And how dare you, who do you think you are in asking for putting together a women's conference? That was also, I should also note that was also the triennial that elected our first woman chair, Myrtle Solomon. So I want to look a bit at the timeline. I think that this is, and just thank Natalia, who put this timeline together from work that I did with Ellen and Dory, who I think are both on this call, from some of Cynthia Coburn's work. So that what we see is that the proposal that we made in 1975 resulted in a women's gathering in France, which is the first time that WRI had done such a thing, and that the Feminism and Nonviolence Study Group began out of that, which by 1983 had produced Piecing It Together, Feminism and Nonviolence, which is still a real classic piece, I think, on these issues. The second conference took place in 1980, that gathering. And so what was beginning to happen through those conferences was women networking, women going out to other organizations, women going back to their own sections and affiliates, or going back and creating more of those kinds of networks with War Resisters International, making those kinds of developing those kinds of relationships. And then the third conference took place in 1987 at Glencree in Ireland. And out of that, the WRI Women, which is a publication that Shelley Anderson of International Fellowship of Reconciliation became the editor. By 1988, there were theme groups at the triennial. There were women's theme groups at that triennial. And 1992 became another really important gathering in terms of having a women's gathering in Thailand. So it's the first gathering really in the South that attracted many people. I think I saw Saswati Roy is on this call, and I think that's maybe where Saswati came in into WRI as well. So we began to see women coming in and then going back and really making those kinds of connections. That was also a period of time where the Women's Working Group developed. And I wanted to show a little bit of that timeline because you began to see, I think, an increase in the level of of activity and of impact thanks to the Women's Working Group. I want a couple of quotes here from probably some of the women that are on here right now. Ellen Elster, this is an article in the Broken Rifle that we'll put up in the chat so people can refer back to it, and it is where the timeline is. Ellen wrote, the purposes of the Women's Working Group were to draw additional light on the role of women in peace processes, to bring women's perspective into WRI, drawing on different cultures and traditions, to bring anti-militarist perspectives into women's groups, to network among and provide emotional support to women who are isolated in their anti-militarist work, not least creating a women's only space in War Resisters International. And we had to really fight for that space. We organized ourselves often in the women's group to meet, Women's Working Group to meet a day before the council started, so that we could build solidarity, that we could meet the new women who were often in our host countries, who were not able to meet with us in other places. We reviewed the agenda for the council meetings to make sure our voices were going to be heard. After one council meeting where there was I'll tell that story later. I'll get into that story later. So Veronica Kelly was brought on, a WRI staff person, and was involved in the Women's Working Group. And she talks about, she's referencing Ellen Elster here. I remember Ellen being very clear what we had to do within War Resisters International was bear women in mind constantly and separately. If someone says something about people, think, does this mean the same thing for women as for men or not? It was suggested to go through all WRI statements asking the same thing, checking to make sure that they were correct when applied to women as well as to men. And Veronica goes on and says, now that seems so obvious now, but at that time, having come straight out of nonviolent direct action with women activists, I was unfamiliar about how a large, venerable, gender-mixed anti-militarist organization worked. And I agree with Ellen, those women's meetings within WRI were a lifeline. They were absolutely crucial. We could not make assumptions that we were included in any of this. Other folks, Truly also writes in that it's important to point out through all our meetings and activities, everyone came back home full of inspiration and new context. We wrote articles, had meetings with women and with our male fellow activists in our local peace organizations. It's impossible to measure the impact, but this was only possible because a woman was working in the WRI office. So that Veronica's role in the Women's Working Group was seen as pretty crucial. Ulla Eberhardt describes the political impact on the Women's Action Group in Germany that was influenced by the Women's Working Group. Putting feminist analysis on the table of the peace movement in Germany, taking action as women that made women in the peace movement very visible, and bringing the connection between militarism and violence against women into public awareness. I also want to quote Dory, who I believe is also on, who was also very active with the Women's Working Group. There have been a number of references to the difficulties we faced raising feminist issues within WRI. I would like to be a bit more concrete about that. WRI was filled with members who believed that war resistance meant resistance to conscription, and that other forms of resistance were minor add-ons. So for women to claim our own reason for resistance to war was difficult for many of the male WRI members and leaders, I'm sorry to say, to understand. And as the feminist analysis deepened for some of us, as we saw more clearly the heavy links between misogyny and war making, our commitments grew stronger, but the gap grew wider between us and some of the male members of WRI. So there was one council meeting where the Women's Working Group had had made a presentation that prepared a presentation for the council. But there were two World War II conscientious objectors who were there as visitors. And so our presentation was cut in order for them to be able to speak. And at that the evaluation of council meeting, people were asked to say a word or do a motion that was kind of what they thought of this meeting. And one of the women who had spent a lot of time preparing for the presentation that got cut simply sat there and went, feeling like, and then collapsed onto the table, feeling like we had been shot down, that we had put all of this time and energy in, but that we weren't seen as being valuable enough to remain on a council agenda. Beyond WRI, it's important to see, and beyond our own sections and affiliates, it's important to see how we influenced other organizations as well. Shelley Anderson, who was with International Fellowship of Reconciliation, talked about the importance of how our work influenced the work of the development of the Women's Peacemaker program. So let's just go down back to the timeline a little bit, and again see how this work then became, I think, institutionalized. Ellen Elster and I coordinated a strategic planning process during that, from 94 to 98, and during that process, we had as one of our overarching objectives gender perspective that was integrated into WRI's anti-militarism work. And that was, I think, a really important kind of foundational piece. It was at that meeting in 98 when we agreed to that strategic plan that I became the chair of WRI, and that we had a gender day at the triennial in Croatia. And that we see throughout this that there were then more articles being written in Peace News, and this major conference that WRI and IFOR did together, asking the right questions, gender and nonviolence, an international consultation on women nonviolence trainers. That again was one of those, and I think because of the role of the E4 in the Women's Peacemaker program, we particularly had many more women from Africa where they did a lot of their work, where we had not been connecting with women from Africa through WRI. The first edition of the Handbook for Nonviolent Campaigns included a section on women, and by the second version of that in 2009, we were really rethinking in terms of looking more at gender and looking at non-binary, not just seeing people as men and women. And I think that's an important part of our evolution as in our understanding of gender issues. And then the book, Women Conscientious Objectors, the anthology done by Mike and Ellen, again, was a kind of a breakthrough piece in looking at what does it mean to be a war resistor. We continued to do gender days in many of our gatherings. It felt like in some ways not so much a fight, but still a real need to have. But yet, when we had the triennial in South Africa, when we did the gender conference, I think Julia is on. She and I did a training day, and it just everything blew up because people were not everyone was willing to accept having a gender day or willing to accept the kinds of things that were being said. And I think it is one of the challenges as we do this, and we are international, we are cross-cultural, and we're trying to bring a lot of things together. And so we continue that struggle in so many ways continues, but we feel like I think that we have more ability to do it because of the work that either we have done or that has gone before us and that we can build on, which is really important part of this. Yeah, I encourage folks who are more interested in some of this to look at that April 2020 Broken Rifle on women, gender, and anti-militarism. And I think just in conclusion, that it's important to recognize we are all liberated because of this work. This is not just about women's liberation over men. This is about all of us being able to be more fully human being and recognize the role of all of us in opposing war and the role of gender and militarism. Thanks.